Dear viewers and listeners of Khabar Hub and Radio Candid, Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to another special interview with Dr. Amit Gupta. Dr. Amit Gupta is an associate professor at the USAF Air War College, Alabama. His writings have focused on arms production and weapon proliferation, South Asia and Australian security policies, diaspora politics, popular culture and politics, and more recently on the US-China rivalry and the impact of demography on US foreign policy. His articles have appeared in Orbis, Asian Survey, Security Dialogue, The Roundtable, and Mediterranean Quarterly. He is also the author or editor of 7 books, the most recent of which are Air Power, The Next Generation, published by Howgate Publishing in 2019, and Maritime Heritage and Challenges in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. Today, we'll be discussing Biden's China policy with our guest, Dr. Amit Gupta. Dr. Amit Gupta, welcome to our show. The first question for today is, how far has the Biden administration continued Trump policy in dealing with China? Is the Biden administration still uncertain about its China policy? What does the future holds for the US and China relations? Is the US-China conflict inevitable? What will follow the US war on terrorism? Is it the war on China?
Okay, well, firstly, thank you, Pramod, for the invitation. And let me put it this way, to just give some context. From the times of President George Bush Jr., the US has tried to shift towards having China as a strategic competitor. Along comes 9/11, which is the 20th anniversary tomorrow for us, today for you. And for the next 18 years, Bush and Obama could not shift out of the Middle East. In the 18th year, second year of Trump's presidency, Trump starts to make the push towards China by lessening the Middle East. And he manages to do that by 2 things. One, he says, I'm not going to continue wars. I'm not going to get involved in new wars. And 3, I'm going to get as many countries as possible to recognize Israel. And if you think about it, more countries recognize Israel during the Trump administration than every administration from Carter to Obama put together. So that is the context in which this happens. And what Trump says is, China is our long-term strategic rival. We must now gear domestic policy, economic policy, and military security policy towards countering the Chinese challenge. This is what Biden inherits. And I should add one more thing. Trump starts the trade wars against China by raising tariffs. Biden inherits this, and the Biden administration is actually quite grateful because Trump has done all the hard work. So what you're doing now, what you're seeing now in the Biden administration is a continuation of some aspects of Trump policy, along with things that the Biden administration considers important. Now, what is a continuation is, the United States is going to challenge China, compete with China, and cooperate with China under Biden. The challenges are going to be the same ones that the Trump administration had in mind. One being, do not allow the Chinese to exercise sovereignty over the East and South China Sea. This has become a core issue. And especially since you've got these new maritime rules coming out of China, which seem to become more and more geared towards making the South China Sea and the East China Sea Chinese preserves rather than international waterways. So that is going to be the first part of the challenge. I think the Biden administration is quite serious about human rights in China. And we've seen this with Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. So that is the second aspect of it, which I think is important. Where they're different from Trump is, there is an understanding that you have to compete technologically with the Chinese. And the Trump administration started this when it started to get tough with Huawei and other Chinese companies in America like TikTok. Where Biden is headed is to try and bring back the kind of technological superiority that America had. Because if you look at the United States doesn't make the best cars in the world, so on. or the best refrigerators or the best televisions. But what it does, it comes up with the newest technology. So in 2007, and it's hard to believe it's only been 14 years, the United States came up with the iPhone. And if you look at it, this transformed the way we look at the world, because we don't have really a phone, we have a computer, handheld computer. And this is thanks to the US. Now, today, the Chinese are making very good phones like OnePlus and Huawei and so on, and they're all half the price of Apple. But the fact is, the Biden administration understands you have to compete. And the areas of competition, number one, 5G. Because whoever controls 5G, and this was said by Vladimir Putin, that whoever controls 5G will dominate the international system of the future. So both the US and the Chinese are trying to establish as much of their global communications network as possible. But the third thing is you have to cooperate. And you have to cooperate for a very simple reason. The global economy is not what it used to be during the Cold War. There is a very high level of integration. And I've said this before when I've talked to the Nepal Institute of International Cooperation. Today, in 2020, China's largest trading partner became ASEAN at about $720 billion. Second largest was the European Union at about 640 billion. Third was the United States at 560. So what the Chinese have done is set up a huge global trading network, which you can't really ignore. And you have to respect that that network will drive the way people think. So if you are Singapore, if you are Thailand, and you have $724 billion of trade with the Chinese, you can't sit there and say, we are pro-American and we completely and wholeheartedly support American policy. There's going to be a balance. Now, what the Biden administration understands is cooperation will have to come because of trade. Cooperation will have to come because of global supply chains. But cooperation will also have to come because you can't do climate change reversal without the Chinese. You can't really develop large parts of the world which are ungoverned spaces or less developed without the Chinese. And I've said this before, the Chinese are laying down the fiber optics, the 5G in Africa, but the Americans can go in with the software and the programming to make all that 5G extremely profitable for these countries. So you have to think in terms of global development. And one of the things which I think comes out of the whole Afghanistan thing is, if you are the United States and you want to make sure that parts of the world don't remain violent, ungoverned spaces, then you need somebody to go in there and create a future for those people. And that future may only be given by the Chinese, because nobody else is willing to invest. Oh, the war on terror becomes the war on China. Look, I wouldn't call it a war. I would call it a competition. And the reason for that is a war would be horribly expensive for both countries. The global economy would collapse. And enough smart people in Beijing and Washington know this. But what you're seeing today is the United States is still number one, but China is number two and is very close to coming on par with the United States. So if this is the case, obviously, if you're number one, you don't want to become equal. You don't want to be number two. So that competition will continue. And I'll say a third part to this competition, because this is going to be determined by countries like Nepal, Singapore, Bangladesh, Myanmar, so on. We keep talking about a Western international or liberal international order. The problem is that is not an order that came out of Asia or Africa. And the countries of Asia and Africa look at that and say, is this necessarily in our best interests? It's all very easy to talk about Western international order if you are Belgium or Sweden. How is that Western liberal international order relevant to Myanmar or Brunei? And in that sense, I think what the Chinese are talking about, where they talk about alternative models of order, is very important to the rest of the world.
Dr. Gupta, how has the US perceived China's new maritime rules designed to control the entry of foreign vessels in what Beijing calls Chinese territorial water in the disputed seas of South China? Is it likely to cause more rift or spike tension in South China Sea?
Oh, I think it will cause more rift. I also think the Chinese are taking a position which needs to be tempered because, look, under law of seas, every country has rights of innocent passage through the territorial waters of your country. And what most countries will say is, please inform us if you're sending a warship through. Nobody says we have to give you permission. The Chinese tend to take a more proactive role, perhaps even a little bit aggressive role in this. The US will push back. The problem for the US is it's not a member of the law of the seas. So you can't tell, this is like I'm telling you, Pramod Jaiswal, I don't have a Nepalese driver's license, but I'm going to tell you what the rules of the road should be in Nepal. And you're going to turn around and say, how are you going to do that when you don't even belong to our club? And in part, that's the problem there. I think what will happen is the Chinese will eventually come to the bargaining table only for one reason. There is no island in the South China Sea which is not occupied. Somebody or the other has occupied all the islands. Now, the only way you can change that is war. But with $724 billion of bilateral trade, not going to happen. They will sit down and start talking. And I think they will start talking because Beijing will realize that it can't keep doing wolf warrior diplomacy. So yes, the US will push. Yes, it will be a cause for concern. Yes, it will lead to militarization by both countries. But will it lead to war? I would say most likely no.
In recent years, the US and its allies have witnessed the steady revitalization of quadrilateral security. How do you gauge its current capabilities? How is it different or similar to any other controversial alliance? And what are the perspectives of its development?
I'm a Quad skeptic. I don't think it's an effective organization. There's a lot of talk and there's a lot of wishful thinking about the Quad. Let me go down what are the problems? Militarily, the Australians, the Japanese, and the US have interoperability. You can take an Australian officer, put him on a Japanese ship, a Japanese on an American ship. They will know what to do because the technology is the same, the training is the same, and they all do exercises together. India doesn't fit into that. And I've written about this to get the Indians to the level where the Australians, Japanese, and Americans are in terms of technology, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, interoperability, so on, is going to be about $100 billion. India doesn't have that kind of money. Nobody's going to give India that kind of money. So how exactly does India fit in? Second thing is the Japanese will confront the Chinese in the East China Sea. I'm not sure they'll go to the South China Sea. The Australians, I've interviewed several Australians on this, including one of their deputy chiefs of the air staff, who said, our border is the southern border of India, maritime border of Indonesia. That is where our prime area of interest is. Now, we may do things like help with tanker missions or supply missions, but to get into conflict with the Chinese is a completely different thing. Also, the Australians are very casualty averse. They would not be able to take 400 or 500 casualties or 1,000 casualties. So I think the military aspect of it doesn't work. The economic aspect of it, well, the Chinese have BRI, the Chinese have the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the Chinese have regional comprehensive economic partnership. The US has yet to come up with anything to compete. And if you want to compete with the Chinese who are spending $1 trillion, then you need to spend at least $500 billion. And if you look at the Biden administration wants to spend close to $4.5 trillion rebuilding America, which actually is the smart thing to do. But the problem then is if you're spending $4.5 trillion in America, where are you going to get the money to spend around the world? So I think the Quad is a non-starter on economic and military issues. I think it can do things in several areas. One, it could build a common 5G network. Two, it could talk about a better educational network for Asia, because Australian universities, American universities, and Japanese universities are world class. Imagine if you could do remote learning for large parts of Asia, which do not have that right now. So I think that would be there. I think the Australians and the Japanese should put their money where their mouth is and boost India's vaccination production programs so more people in Asia can get vaccinated. Because that would be a more compelling argument than saying, hey, I put an aircraft carrier off the coast of Vietnam. Nobody cares. Okay? So the Quad to me is an idea which sort of comes out of the Cold War, because this is what you did in the Cold War. You built alliances, you built military capabilities. We don't live in that kind of world now. And honestly, if you're sitting in Kathmandu, I don't think anybody in Kathmandu is cheering for a Quad. But if tomorrow the members of the Quad came and said, we are going to guarantee that by the end of 2022, every Nepalese will be vaccinated, I think you'll get a gigantic cheer coming out of the country of Nepal. And in the long run, which is more important for the Nepalese people. So you have to stop thinking in terms which are Cold War centric. You have to start thinking in post-Cold War in terms of the welfare of greater humanity. And the Quad could do it, but right now there's no valuable thinking in that area. I'll add one thing on this. No Asian country is going to join the Quad because everybody knows the economic basket of bread is buttered by the Chinese. And the Europeans do not have the money to come all the way into the South China Sea and East China Sea.
How can the Indian Navy expand its reach in the Pacific Ocean through the recently signed Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement between the United States and India?
Okay, this is, you're getting me to talk on something where I am distinctly unpopular. Let me put it to you this way. The Indian Navy's plans, I've given this talk to the National Maritime Foundation in Delhi, 50% of whom agreed with me, 50% of whom disagreed. And those who disagreed didn't listen to what I said. They listened to one sentence and made that into my thesis, which is not the way things are done. So that one sentence was aircraft carriers would be highly vulnerable in the South and East China Sea. There would be a better use in the Western Indian Ocean. That was made into India doesn't need aircraft carriers, which is not what I said. The problem for India is quite simply this. The Indians can make China's life miserable if they had a large submarine force with cruise missiles. Because it's not easy to find submarines. Submarines can inflict a lot of damage, and you can hurt a lot of Chinese maritime shipping and naval shipping that way. So I would say this, you can have talks about going into the South China Sea. Going into the South China Sea is not that easy because the Chinese have a very high defensive capability. Second thing is you have to have the logistics, which are very expensive, to support a naval force in the South China Sea. And I just don't see that happening. Where I see the Indian Navy playing a role is in the Indian Ocean, where it should be talking about a maritime order, but instead of talking China, it should be talking about how can it help the countries of West Asia and Africa. And I'll give you one example. In 2004, the African Union had its annual meeting in Mozambique. And the government of Mozambique went to the Indian government and said, can you give us naval security? So the Indians sent down some naval vessels a few days before the meeting. And then after the meeting was over, they left immediately. The Mozambicans were very happy. This is the kind of thing I think the Indian Navy does well. And I think the Indian Navy should do. Going into the South China Sea would be a death trap. The people who, there's a lot of talk, for example, that the British would go there. The problem for most analysts in the world is they don't read Chinese. Read what the Chinese think are the prospects for a naval battle with large vessels like aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. It's not what it's suggested to be in capitals like New Delhi, London, or Washington. So my own belief is it's a non-starter. It's like everything else. In South Asia, people love to sit and chat and come up with agreements. I mean, you know this, you've worked in India. India has strategic partnerships with dozens of nations. And as I always say, you feel sorry for the countries that India doesn't have a strategic partnership with. But if you are a strategic partner of everybody, it means you're the strategic partner of nobody. Because if you look at the United States has two key strategic partners, Britain and Israel. It has allies, but they come at a lower level. So Belgium is an ally, Brazil is an ally. But in real terms, the two countries which it sees as being very closely tied to strategic interests are Britain and Israel. And the Indian problem is this: you can talk naval cooperation, everything else, but is India on par with Israel and Britain in the eyes of the United States? The answer is no. And I've always said this to the Indians, that you need to tell the Americans, this is what we want, and if you give it to us, we will be your long-term strategic partners. The Indians can never give that answer. See, it's like if I were to ask you, Pramod, what do I need to do to improve your life so that you will be a partner in my enterprise? You can say, well, I would like funds to do more research. I would like funds to hire more research staff, so on. But you can give concrete recommendations. You're not getting that out of New Delhi. Because every time I ask this question, I never get an answer. So I'm sorry to disappoint your viewers, but I think it's a non-starter. It's good talk. It's a good talking point. Maybe 20, 30 years down the line, it does develop into something valuable.
Dr. Gupta, as Russia, China, and the United States are pursuing their own version of hypersonic weapons technology, does this signal a new arms race in the region? And will such development just be limited to these three countries?
The three you mentioned are the top tier of hypersonic missile development. The Indians and the French are the second tier. And then everybody else comes below that. It is a new arms race. There is no doubt about that. But look, I would put it differently. To my mind, we've got to remember one thing. You can start a short, nasty war with high technology. But to win the war, you have to occupy a country. And that means sitting in that country for 20, 30, 50 years. And as you saw in Afghanistan, 20 years was too much. So hypersonics could lead to an expensive war where Americans and Chinese shoot down each other's aircraft, hit each other's ships. But does that lead to a long-term conclusion of the war? The answer is no. But is it an arms race? Absolutely. And I will say this. We are now entering a phase where the Americans and the Chinese will pull ahead of everybody else in terms of weapons technology. The Russians will come in somewhere after that, along with the Europeans. And the rest of the world will be far below that. Because nobody can afford all this expensive weapons systems. I mean, I'll give you an example. When the US launches a cruise missile is over $1 million. And if the US fires 300 cruise missiles in a day, that's $300 million of cruise missiles. Ask yourself how many countries in the world can afford that? And the answer is maybe 3, maybe 4. So yes, you have a technological race. No, it's not going to change significant conflict areas in the world.
After the US withdrawal, there is a power vacuum of great powers in Afghanistan. Who is going to fill the gap? Do you see the possibility of a China, Pakistan, Taliban axis?
You know this. You've been to Kabul, right? Yes, you have. Okay. So you are a better analyst than most people who claim to write on the Afghans. And there is an old expression about the Afghans. You cannot buy the loyalties of the Afghans, but you can rent their loyalties. So the Russians rented their loyalties, the Americans rented their loyalties. Most probably the Chinese will temporarily rent their loyalties. And access is too strong a word because the Chinese are not interested in getting bogged down militarily or physically in Afghanistan. They are willing to give some degree of economic help. What they're really concerned about is that Afghanistan should not be a staging point for launching terror attacks into China. And with this in mind, they are going to shape their entire Afghan policy. The second thing is, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this, because you are in the region and therefore understand this better than me sitting in Alabama. Does anybody really believe there's going to be a Pakistan-Taliban axis? Or is it some kind of semi-convenient arrangement? What are your thoughts?
I think many believe that they already have kind of such engagement.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to say wait and see. I'm going to say wait and see because the Russians want to put some money in, the Chinese want to put some money in. Who knows what the Iranians want to do? But if the Iranians were imaginative, they would let the Indians build that road rail link out of Iran into Afghanistan, because it would change the way Afghanistan geopolitics was concentrated or organized. So I would put it that way. I think it's too strong to talk about an Afghan-Taliban-Chinese alliance. And there is one reason. Once you start allowing Afghanistan to become a terror camp, to stage attacks on countries in the region, especially Iran and India, the next step is it'll happen in Xinjiang. There is no doubt about this. And the reason being, everybody thinks you can control terrorist groups. The answer is you can't. It's never worked well. Anybody who's tried to control terror groups has found out they tend to be independent thinkers. You remember the LTTE in Sri Lanka. How well did that go for India's research analysis wing? And the answer is not well at all. I will leave it on that skeptical note. Yes.
Thank you, sir. In the pursuit of India's Act East policy, Indian Navy ships had proceeded to an overseas deployment, Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, and Western Pacific. What does this recent deployment seek to underscore, especially in regard to India's policy in the South China Sea? Does this indicate a shift in Indian policy?
Look, the Indians are doing what from their perspective is the right thing. They're trying to show the Chinese that we're not going to buckle down to you. Okay? So you have a greater presence. The question is, if you're going to be there, who is in that part of the world is going to support you? You know, the Vietnamese, there's a lot of talk about the Vietnamese being in a Quad Plus. If you talk to any Vietnamese, what is the one thing they say? We don't want to be part of the Quad. Because Vietnam is one of China's 10 largest trading partners now. So while they have differences with China, they don't want to aggravate China. And you can send ships on missions, do exercises, so on. But in real terms, are you doing synchronized military planning with anyone? And the answer is no. So again, 20, 30 years down the line, we don't know. In the short to medium term, which is 5 to 10 years, I would say the answer is no. It's symbolic rather than substantive.
Dr. Amit Gupta, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Pramod.